Well, the one that I can't seem to move very far from is the 9/11, which was used as an excuse for all of this. And I would love to hear you talk about 9/11. I'm sure you've been exploring that one also.
It was used as an excuse for all of this. I did a right-wing radio show in Philadelphia the other day on this tour, and it was a civilized one. It wasn't one of those scream at you and call you a communist ones. And yet it was all obsessed with 9/11. And this radio host, a man named Michael Smerkonish, told me that he stays up all night. He loses sleep over not being able to get justice by getting those guys in Pakistan who are hiding in the mountains who are responsible for 9/11. You know, never mind that more people are lost to dozens of causes such as insufficient health care every year. I mean, if he cared about everything, he would get no sleep ever, right? But he wants to know what I would have done about 9/11. And my first response was, when George Tenet started telling me repeatedly in July and August, and I got a memo in the beginning of August that said plans to fly planes into buildings, I would have stopped reading comic books and clearing brush for a second and paid a little attention to it. And when Richard Clark says that there was a concerted effort in the previous administration that was simply abandoned by Rumsfeld and Bush, this is why I worked with Congressman Kucinich, who put in 3 articles of impeachment against Bush, who was clearly criminally negligent. But I think far worse is the use to which he put 9/11, to which it is still being put. We are now being told on our televisions that somehow the Taliban is responsible for 9/11, right? So, you know, the planning was done more than anywhere else in hotels and apartments in Germany and Spain and this country, and in flight training schools in this country. And we didn't go bomb every county where there was a flight training school to punish those people, right? We did when there was a building bombed in Oklahoma City. We didn't bomb Oklahoma and then go bomb Oregon for good measure. You know, it's not an appropriate response. A crime is a crime. You treat it as a crime. The first attack on the World Trade Center was treated as a crime, and people were put in prison. And when you go bomb people as a response in an illegal, aggressive war, you generate more hostility and more terrorism, as we have done. You make us less secure, not more so. But when you use a crime to launch a very vague war, a war on an emotion or a tactic, in which you can go and launch real wars on a variety of nations, then you open up sort of the eternal power of a president in a war time to strip us of our rights and seize more powers. And it was always understood that presidents were going to take more powers through war. War has always been the way. This was what was feared by the people who wrote the Constitution, and they were dead right. But now when you have a permanent war and a completely vague war and a very frightening war to the point where we're afraid to put people in maximum security prisons in our country because they would just wander out with their magical Muslim skills, then you're in a very, very, very dangerous situation.
David, just may I follow up on that? I was thinking about the theory of controlled demolition of those buildings, and also the mysterious ways that the buildings came down.
Three buildings.
In 3 buildings, and one of them was never hit. It just fell down. And the 10-second collapse, straight down, by the way, not just side to side, but straight down. And 911mystery.com, which is a great website, and all of the thinking that's gone into analyzing the possible fallacy of the story that those planes were not actually what brought those buildings down. It was actually the controlled demolition.
Controlled by Cheney.
controlled by Cheney. Now, have you thought about all that? I can't imagine you haven't.
You're scary.
I've gone and spoken at events like this, big and small, for 5 years. It's very difficult to leave one without being handed books, DVDs, reports, bumper stickers, and T-shirts about 9/11.
Bottom line.
And I don't know what that means, bottom line.
Well, to me it means if it was a fake, if it was set up actually and controlled and created by our own.
But everybody in this room, including me, has seen lots of DVDs and read lots of books about this. If you'd like my response, I'd be happy to give it to you. Respectfully, I think it hurts us. It hurts any cause for peace or justice that has any credibility to engage in theories that look laughable when you look into them in any depth. And I say that not because the corporate media considers them unrespectable. I encourage you to have absolutely no fear in pushing your views without self-censorship, even if they are views that the corporate media despises and will hurt some other cause you're working on. Too bad that you cannot self-censor in that way. But when, in your own understanding, as in mine, you're dealing with theories that look ludicrous when you look into them in any way, then you're hurting yourself and you're hurting a lot of other causes and you're misdirecting limited energies into something that's not that helpful. And I think we've had a cover-up. We haven't had a proper investigation. We absolutely need one. But if we had one, I have no doubt that it would not find a lot of the theories I've read about. Of course, it couldn't find all of them because they don't all agree with each other. But if I were going to stage a phony attack and destroy some buildings, and I were trying to concoct a way to do that, I wouldn't try to figure out how to simultaneously destroy them in two different ways, just to create more possible ways in which things could go wrong, and then blame it on only one of those ways. And if I were doing it in order to attack Iraq, I wouldn't make sure to blame it on a bunch of guys from Saudi Arabia. And frankly, it disturbs me to my soul that so many people think that if we could expose that crime, it would radically change everything because it would be so much worse than anything else that's been done. When we're talking about 3,000 people, every one of them is a human being with families and friends, but we have 1.3 million people in Iraq alone dead at our hands. And the idea that there's something worse about killing 3,000 people in this country, when a lot of them are Americans, and I'm not saying that you think this, but a lot of people seem to be under the impression that that crime, were it, it's undisputably a crime of criminal negligence at the very least, but were it the crime that so many people imagine it could be, that would be so earth-shattering because it would reveal Bush and Cheney to be murderous liars, Bush and Cheney are world champion murderous liars of Americans as well as non-Americans, and you don't need one particular incident to demonstrate that.
You didn't answer my question, though. But
But
thank you for what you said.
I think those theories are ludicrous, counterproductive nonsense. Does that answer your question?
But I don't understand. You didn't really address the thinking, not the.
Respectfully, could I ask if anyone else has any other questions on any other topics? And if they don't, I'd be happy to continue on this one. But with respect to the people who are in the room who came to talk about a different topic, they might be sitting here with questions on that other topic. Yeah.
The Mid-March Action, is that the one Cindy Sheehan's organizing? Is that?
Yeah, she's involved, yeah.
I know a couple people already that plan on going. How long do we have to be there?
As long as you can afford it. Yes, ma'am.
In view of the fact blaming the Taliban for 9/11. We know that aside from where all these conspiracies or preparations were taking place, most of the overwhelming majority of the perpetrators were Saudis. Why haven't we attacked Saudi Arabia?
It's an excellent point, a rhetorical point. I don't actually want to attack Saudi Arabia, but it's an excellent point.
Rhetorically by me too.
Yes, yes. Well, I understand. And it's one of the endless problems with the idea of some of these theories, because, if you had wanted to attack Saudi Arabia, you would have blamed it on a bunch of fictional Saudis in invisible airplanes or whatever. But if you had wanted to attack Iraq, you might have done it a little differently from that. But, yes?
I'm sorry I was late.
You're forgiven.
You might have covered this. I like your idea of trying to say, let's focus on Congress and the House of Representatives, and here's some reasons why I think that's a good way to go. And one of that idea of the control over the budget, that you hear that argument, but you also hear the other argument is the issue of, if you cut the budget, it's like the Rambo myth, that the soldiers are out there in the field and they're like and they're out of bullets,
Yes.
And then they get overrun and destroyed because we cut the money for them that's feeding them and giving them the weapons and the bulletproof jackets and stuff.
Yes.
So A, how do you counter that idea, or how does the budget get stopped in a way that people don't feel like we're hurting our own people? And secondly, what do you know about soldiers or military people who are involved now in trying to stop the war?
Great bunch of questions. Obviously, you could pass a bill in Congress that says here's funding for withdrawal and nothing other than withdrawal. Use this money for withdrawal and amply fund a withdrawal. I mean, it's sort of ludicrous. I mean, it's pocket change to the Pentagon to withdraw. But if you wanted to do that, to deal with some nonsensical rhetoric that's out there on the televisions, do it. And no opponents of the wars are going to object to a bill like that. It's certainly a powerful talking point, or at least our televisions and newspapers pretend it is when they want to. Again, this past June, every single Republican in the House of Representatives who for 6 years has said it would be treason, it would leave our men and women in the field without bullets, voted no on the war bill. And there is not a peep anywhere of endangering the troops or not supporting the troops. Not a word. Not a goddamn word. And, a couple of years, but still, I'm not dismissing how powerful this nonsense is. It's just that you can get around it, and you can show that it can be very easily gotten around. A couple of years ago, a friend of mine, who's a woman whose son had been to Iraq twice, who had tried to commit suicide a number of times. The VA would not help him with anything. They're sending him back for the third time. And she runs into Congressman David Obey, who I mentioned, in the hallways in Congress, and asks him, as we were asking all of them at this point, this was in 2007, you say you oppose the wars, we elected you to oppose the wars, could you stop funding the wars? And he screams at her, as he has a tendency to do, and denounces idiot liberals who think that you can just defund a war because that wouldn't be supporting the troops. And what he's going to do is end the war by funding it in a particular way, right? They were going to end it that year, right? How'd that work out? And now he takes the position that support the troops means taking serious concern for whether you fund sending people to kill and die in a pointless, hopeless cause. So here's someone who has completely reversed his rhetoric, just as any of us can do. And needless to say, we're not funding troops. We're funding wars. We're funding war profiteers. We're funding contractors and mercenary companies. And if you wanted to take all of that money and put it in the hands of the troops, let them do what they want with it. And the ones who want to stay and keep fighting, they call it an all-volunteer army after all. And the ones who want to fly home, that would be okay with me. There are a lot of active members of the military resisting. And I was recently doing a fundraiser at the Under the Hood Cafe, and I encourage all of you to go to underthehoodcafe.com and support them, because this is a cafe set up by veterans for active duty service members next to Fort Hood. And I've spoken with veterans of these wars there who told me that this cafe saved their lives, that they were going to lose it. They were going to commit suicide, and they were shown they had a choice. They didn't have to go. In fact, they had an obligation to disobey an illegal order. And some of them have not had any time behind bars. Some of them have had some months behind bars. Some of them are still behind bars. But they are going to come out much stronger, and they are going to be much more effective in ending this madness than shooting up their fellow troops on base, which accomplishes nothing. But these people are heroes, and those of us who aren't in that position have to support them. We have to support Courage to Resist. We have to support IVAW, Iraq Veterans Against the War. We have to support Veterans for Peace. We have to support these cafes that have been reborn, many of them literally reincarnations of Vietnam-era cafes, because, they have to be shown. The soldiers at Fort Hood have been complaining that they don't know why we're in Afghanistan or Iraq. Nobody else does either. But when you're being sent to kill and die there, and you don't know why, it makes you nuts. Apparently it can make your counselor nuts.
A lot of counselors are nuts.
I mean nuts to the point of mass murder. Mass murder is what these people are trained to do. It's sick for the president to denounce the horrendous act of violence by people being trained to be, as Martin Luther King said, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, but on non-Americans. But there is a lot of resistance. You go places like Korea and talk to the troops who've gone there intentionally to avoid another tour in Iraq or Afghanistan, and they're all being sent back to Iraq and Afghanistan, and they're resisting. They have to be encouraged in that. Here and then here.
Bill Moyers last night had a program on called The Good Soldier. I don't know if you saw it, but he...
No, I haven't. I heard about it, but I haven't seen it.
There was an interview with at least 4 soldiers who had really had an emotional breakdown as a result of their experiences. And also for them it was an awakening. They awoke to the fact that they were murderers and that they were being trained to be murderers. That was it. And that some of them actually got to the point where they enjoyed the experience. And at that point there kicked in this moral conscience, which I hope we all have, and they started to realize that there was something seriously wrong with the whole process, and they wanted out, and they wanted to spread that word to others. And that's what being a soldier means, to kill, destroy. And it must wreak havoc on someone's mental state to be put in that situation. And I don't think this is really understood. The Iraqi Veterans Against the War group came here to the Vineyard and did a presentation, and they had a book of poetry that they put together, and it was so enlightening, and they were so enlightened by their experience and so turned against it. Mm-hmm. We need to look at that. We don't need drones.
There are a lot of these soldiers obviously have no contact with they may get to see Bill Moyers, but that's maybe the only thing on standard television that's going to address that for them. No other program. They may get to see it online. They may, but probably not, have any contact with anyone in this room who can reach them and talk in these terms. When Daniel Ellsberg was working to kill more people in Vietnam, and his friends started taking him to peace events, and he started meeting with people who were sacrificing their lives, going to prison for life to end what he was doing. It hit his conscience and it turned him around, and he put out the Pentagon Papers and helped end the thing. But if those people hadn't had that opportunity to talk to him, if nobody had reached him, who knows if he would have done it alone. And there are good groups, these cafes, these Iraq veterans, Against the War, Veterans for Peace. There's a group in D.C. called the Center on Conscience and War that I think soldiers should know about. There's a group called Courage to Resist. Soldiers can go to my website, afterdowningstreet.org, and find out a lot and who to contact. But a lot of them, most of them go in because they have no other real choices for employment. And we have to be dealing with this and conversion and shifting. But they swear an oath, and they're told their responsibilities, and it's all about defense. It's all about self-defense. It's all depicted as very similar to defending yourself or your loved ones from direct violent attack, right? In which case everybody's going to fight back violently. And that's how it's laid out before them. And then they're persuaded, many of them, that it's actually defense of our nation to go attack some helpless nation halfway around the world on the basis of ludicrous lies. And of course, for many of them, as for many of us, most of us have nothing to do with the actual fight, but we want to believe the government's doing the right thing because we're happier that way. There's a willful effort to believe the lies, right? And a lot of people who believed the lies about Iraq and 9/11 and Iraq and the weapons did so not because they were persuaded by anything, but because they wanted to believe that was the only reason the government would have attacked Iraq. And there was a study that came out last week where they sat down, a lengthy survey, study, research project with a lot of people who still believe that Iraq attacked the World Trade Center. And they present them with pieces of evidence in a systemic way, including videotape of George W. Bush saying, of course, Iraq had nothing to do with attacking the World Trade Center. Over 90% of the people, they couldn't dissuade them. They couldn't change their minds. And they invent elaborate explanations for why it's still true that Iraq attacked the World Trade Center. If you put lies out there over and over and over again that feed into something people are going to want to believe, then you can be pretty effective. But then if you're involved in killing and dying and your friends dying for these lies and you find out they're lies, that can ruin you. Not to mention the horrors of killing and seeing the violence. And so we have huge percentage of our troops coming home with brain damage, coming home with PTSD, and coming sort of home to our bases around the world with the same problems, which creates problems there in those countries. The heroes are the ones who refuse, but all of them need help. We have to do that because we let this be done. I think.
Actually, I was at a meeting today of the Cape Cod for Peace and Justice. So I just wanted to run by you and the group where in the spring we're going to put forward town meeting warrant articles in the 15 towns on Cape Cod. And it's a one-sentence article that says, and I want your feedback, but it says, to see if the town of whatever will direct Representative Delahunt and Senator Kerry to vote no on any more funding for the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and support the withdrawal of all troops from these countries by the end of 2010. So we're going to put that before our 15 towns on the Cape. You might want to do it here at Martha's Vineyard. how's that wording? Is that too soon, the end of 2010?
Well, and just as a I mean, I completely agree with the spirit. I might leave the second half of it off. I mean, if they're not going to provide any more funding, then the withdrawal has to happen with existing funding as quickly as possible. You could say they will not provide any funding except exclusively for a speedy withdrawal. But to pick a date makes it tricky, and it makes it less useful if we actually go past that date and we still want to end the damn thing. So I'm not sure about the, and all the major peace groups, formally have the position, bring everybody home immediately. And so it becomes very tricky to get a lot of peace groups to sign on to some particular date, that differs from immediately, and rightly so. Yeah.
Just extending that idea, one of the ideas I got from what you said earlier, and I think from someplace in the book too, is the confounding in people's minds of cutting off funding and not supporting the troops and not paying for VA hospitals and so forth. So it struck me that a pair of bills, one to cut off funding for the war, and two to ensure funding for the VA and for treatment of returning troops would be an ideal kind of combination. To make that explicit, that you're supporting the troops in this way.
It would, and I would support it, and I certainly support half of it. I support the bill for full funding for veterans, full health, education, recovery, recuperation, everything that they could possibly need. I support it. I think doing that in combination with what we need to do to end the war would be ideal politically. I get it. I'm 100% for it. But I think you missed what I think is my most important point, which is you don't end the funding by passing a bill. You end the funding by stopping funding it. Because if you try to pass...
The first part would be to stop funding.
Yes, in that case, I completely agree. Yeah. Stop funding the wars and pass a bill to fully fund veterans' care, which is a very different thing from what we have been doing, which is putting something for veterans in a war funding bill and then saying you can't vote against this or you'd be hurting the veterans. Right? That's been the practice. Or if you put Katrina victims relief or hate crimes legislation, I'm waiting for free kittens for children. They'll put anything in a war funding bill. And then they say if you vote against this, you don't like children who want kittens, right? When they can of course pass that in a separate bill. So yes, the House should stop funding the wars, and both houses and the president should pass, although they recently have done a lot of this, should still pass additional bills for veterans' care and relief and so forth. The trickiest part with that is that they did it in a major way within the past couple of years. And I want universal health care, and I want universal free education, and that includes veterans. I want it for everybody. But it's certainly the case if your Congress member is afraid that he'll be accused of hating veterans, that he or she can do all kinds of things to help veterans at the same time as ceasing creating more damaged veterans. Yes?
It seems to me that one of the major problems is changing the perception from the notion that I struggle with, because I'm an extremely loyal American and I feel like we are a protected country. No longer. But I want to think that way. And so, I don't think I'm alone. That I think a lot of us still are riding on, particularly those of us who had parents in World War II or remember those stories and all those kinds of things. And we're taught about our history in terms of freeing ourselves from the British, all that kind of stuff. It's hard to have a perception of what our country is really like, and the media is bad, and the only media that I see right now that is working is Democracy Now! Amy Goodman?
Of course.
And so is there some way you think also we should be working very hard to get people to turn off the regular news?
Absolutely. Nothing more valuable.
And so how do we do that? And is there some way that's being done on local levels effectively?
Yes, and I have a book that goes into it at some length that's here for sale. But to give a briefer response, peace groups buying full-page ads in the New York Times for peace and bragging about it and transferring tens of thousands of dollars to the New York Times, without which we wouldn't have these wars, is counterproductive in the not very long term. And going on Fox News and then sending that YouTube around and bragging about it, which I'll confess to having done, is counterproductive. We should not give them the respect. We should not deal with these institutions. For the most part, people would be better off throwing their televisions out the window or disposing them in some environmentally safe way and unsubscribing from corporate newspapers that are destroying our nation and are dying. And they're dying, and they'd like to bring us all down with them, I think. But support good media outlets, including Democracy Now!, including thousands and thousands of good radio shows and websites and blogs and investigative reporting operations that you'll be told, well, they don't reach enough people, you'll just be preaching to the choir. But the more money you give them, the more support you give them, the more promotion you give them, the more people they reach. And they're growing.
But are there like national blackout days where everybody turns off those, the standard news and things?
Not that I know of, and I'm not sure that would actually hurt them. There are, campaigns to get sponsors to drop Glenn Beck's program, but he's there for political reasons. He's not there just for advertisements. He's not going to go away. He's in fact seeing his viewership go up as his advertisers pull out. In the long term, we have to do what Argentina just did and bust up the monopolies. I mean, we have a handful of mega international corporations. Glenn Beck, who's afraid of international corporations, works for one. And it's a cartel. They have interlocking board members with other corporate interests. GE is a weapons company. NBC is GE. It's almost as bad as anywhere in the world, and maybe worse because nobody knows it is. And we have to bust them up. We have to have public media, nonprofit, community media. We have to have freedom of the press for more than just the people who own the press. We have to radically change our communication system. We have to have a great expansion of just straightforward footage like C-SPAN, and we have to have free coverage for elections to take away the single greatest expense for which the legalized bribery system exists, and so on. But even in the short run, and in the individual easy things to do, there's almost nothing more important than supporting good local and national media outlets and taking support away from the bad ones. And Democracy Now! is a great one of the best, by all means. Support it. But one of the main reasons to stop watching most television and stop reading most newspapers is that you'll get the impression that most Americans are lunatics, and they aren't. And if you look at chapter 22 in my book, I look at the survey of polls of, right, if you look at serious polls done by the same media outlets that tell us that most of the country is a bunch of freaks, the polls say the exact opposite. And we have strong majorities for single-payer health care, for defunding the military, for building schools, for international law, for getting the corporations out of Washington, for upholding the Fourth Amendment, you name it. We're wiser, more sophisticated, more generous than we think we are. And most of us who are in a majority on an issue think we're in some small minority and think that the most important thing we have to do is convince other people of the error of their ways. When we're 80%, they're 20%, they're getting more coverage on television, we don't actually have to win over that last 20% in what is supposed to be a nation ruled by the majority. Well, we already have 80%. doesn't do any harm. Education is a very important thing. We have to educate young people, but to kick ourselves for being bad messengers with poor framing and not having good message discipline, when we don't own the television stations and they put on these inarticulate Neanderthals because they agree with their views and they promote the idea that 60% of the public belong to this right-wing fringe southern regional party called the Republicans, you get the wrong impression. So get your media from good websites and radio shows. Be aware of all the media. Be aware of people who are threatening to assassinate the president and others and so forth. And a guy was just sentenced to 3 years in prison today for such a threat, which is much more appropriate than, assuming he was properly tried, is much more appropriate than letting people roam around at your rallies with guns, Is there anybody else who hasn't asked anything yet? Okay, way back there, and then in the front.
Okay, sorry for being late also. I really appreciate your talk and your scope and your humor. Two topics I'd like you to comment on, if I could just fill it in a little. One is propaganda, and the other, you touched a little bit, independent politics or voting reform. I'm glad the 9/11 subject came up because a couple of summers ago I had knee surgery and had too much time and discovered all these YouTube videos, showing the so-called 9/11 truth, the proof of demolition. I watched hours and hours and hours with a real open mind. 100% of it was nonsense to me. 100%. There was nothing. I mean, broken glass falling from the building is evidence of explosions on the side of the building. I mean, it was just, it's like a belief system. And I really think after digesting this hours and hours and hours, days and days, I thought this is a propaganda operation. It's a propaganda operation to discredit, to distract, to drain away energy, to make people who would otherwise be skeptical of those in power for what they've already proven to have done, to go after these fantasies, and then you can use that as a wedge against the rest of the population who would otherwise listen to your skeptical arguments about Iraq and Afghanistan as they are, rather than as a conspiracy. So, anyways. But I have to challenge you when even you, like the mainstream media and the politicians, use the term wars. So why should we, in a petition or in a speech or in a congressional lobby or something, be talking about cutting war funding? It should be occupation funding, because otherwise I feel like we're playing on their field. I think we really do have to just fundamentally take back the language. I'd be curious what you think about that. And then secondly, if you can say anything about independent politics, Dennis Kucinich mentioned Ron Paul, Bernie Sanders, Ralph Nader, these third parties in voting reform, different voting systems to allow independent voices into our system, because frankly, I think the two-party system is corrupt beyond belief and broken and useless in the 19th century, and we're in the 21st century. So could you talk about this?
Well, I'm going to try to talk about all that in less than 45 minutes. And I do recommend a book I've written that deals with, I think, everything you talked about. But, I haven't seen, and I agree with you on most, if maybe not 100%, but most of the 9/11 truth stuff I don't find convincing. But I have not seen any evidence that anyone has created that field of research for us intentionally to distract our energies away from something else. So I'm not going to believe that one either unless I see some evidence.
No, it's being used. However it evolved, I'm just saying it's being used that way to distract and distract.
Well, that I don't know if anyone is using it that way. I know it's having that effect.
Okay.
I think that it was very difficult for Americans to believe that a handful of guys, poorly educated, dark-skinned, foreign Muslim guys who went and taught themselves to fly in a couple of weeks, could take some box cutters and destroy the icons of the world's nuclear power. It was very difficult for people to believe that that's all there was to it, right? If a level of hatred of us around the world could motivate people to attack us in that way, and all they needed was box cutters and a little motivation and a willingness to sacrifice themselves, then why were we building these nuclear arsenals? What was all of this about our national security? It's a joke. So it was very hard for people to believe that that was all there was to it. Whereas if Dick Cheney had masterminded it with an elaborate plot and the buildings had been destroyed simultaneously in different ways and so forth, it's in a way more comforting for some people. And we're in a situation where our government lies to us about everything. You can't believe anything they say. They lie much more than they tell the truth. And they lie about worse things than 9/11. And we like to think that the truth will set us free, right? I was involved in promoting awareness of pieces of evidence that we relied into Iraq, like the Downing Street Minutes, and at first they had a huge impact. Millions of people got involved, calling the media, calling Congress. If we can get this information out there, then they'll end the wars, they'll impeach Bush and Cheney, everything will change. The truth will set us free. And of course it doesn't. It doesn't. It's not a question of persuading. They knew it was a pack of lies before they approved the war. It's a question of making it too difficult for them to ignore us, making their lives miserable until they represent us. And so there's a desire, I think, this is my amateur psychology, there's a desire among a lot of people to think, if we could just expose, and I've been told this repeatedly, including by emails today from random strangers, that if we could expose the truth about 9/11, everything would change, all the crimes would end, the government would collapse. I'm not saying everyone who believes 9/11 theories that I disagree with thinks in any of the particular ways I'm suggesting, but I certainly think that some people do. And so I don't think you need necessarily the explanation that somebody invented this to send people off on the wrong track. Yes, by all means use the word occupation. These are occupations. I'm not sure you shouldn't also use the word war. I mean, we are occupying 120, 130 countries around the world. And most of those look very different from what Iraq and Afghanistan look like. War is a very different thing now from what it used to be. Mostly civilians die in wars. Wars can be very one-sided. They use vastly different weaponry and so on, but they are wars.
In a question legally, though, I read that Iraq resolution, and if it was all WMD, Saddam Hussein, all those conditions are gone. I mean, they were not there to begin with. So legally, I don't see the term war even in the actual bill online, on whatever it is in the congressional website.
You won't, but war is the term used in our Constitution, in the War Powers Act, in the United Nations Charter. When the United Nations said, no, this is illegal, we will not support it, it was all in the context of a question of war. When the president makes a treaty with Iraq and calls it a status of forces agreement, and therefore he doesn't have to ask the Senate because it's not a treaty, it's still a treaty in the sense that he damn well ought to ask the Senate. And when we kidnap people and send them off to be tortured, but we call it rendition, because it looks different from most kidnappings, it's still kidnapping in the sense that it's a crime that ought to be prosecuted. And so when we engage in an endless, brutal occupation of a country that involves killing people constantly with weapons that are used on what we call battlefields. In fact, we've renamed the entire globe the battlefield of the war on terror. Well, it's still a war in the sense that the president ought not to be able to do it without Congress. It's a violation of international law. It's a violation of the Constitution. It's a violation of the War Powers Act. Now,
does the Constitution say anything about insurgencies? Because that's what we're calling it now.
Yes,
it's
we call it
another linguistic wiggle.
Yes, we call what we would in other cases call freedom fighters or patriotic resistors.
Or
We call them,
depending on which side we're on.
Exactly.
yes, of course, we call them insurgents. But I guess my basic point is I understand that they are occupations and that there's a value to educating the American public about the fact that they are occupations, and I don't want to take anything away from that. But I don't want to have renaming something be an excuse for new abuses of power. Kucinich, I used to work for. I have been talking to him a lot in recent days. I like him. He's, in my opinion, dramatically better than the other 434 people. I think, Senator Sanders is one of a handful of senators that are markedly better than the others, although it's a very low bar. I think, that Ron Paul is right on the war and wrong on everything else. I think that parties are a huge corrupting force in our government. We don't have 3 branches anymore. We have 2 parties, and one party is led by the guy who was supposed to execute the will of Congress and instead tells his party members in Congress what to do. The parties are the big funders. The money corruption goes through the parties, and if a party's not going to fund your campaign, and they're going to fund a primary challenger against you, and they're not going to let you be a chairman of a committee, and they're not going to give you weapons factories in your district and your earmarks and your bills, then you're in trouble. And if you fall in line, and they're going to send cabinet officials to go do press conferences in your district with you, and they're going to buy radio ads for you and so on, then you're in good shape. So it's very rare for Congress members to go against their party leadership. So you had 3 Congress members from Massachusetts in June go against the all-out effort of their party leadership and vote no on war money. You have to thank them. When Congressman Wexler from Florida went against the chairman of his committee, the Judiciary Committee, John Conyers, of the same party, and said, "You've got to impeach Dick Cheney," and started a public petition and started organizing his colleagues to sign on and members of the public to sign on, lobbying the chairman of his committee on the same party to uphold a fundamental principle of our Constitution. I don't know of another example of anything that comes anywhere close to that. There's, because you never challenge your party. And the Republicans never, ever, ever, ever go against the Republican leader. And the Democrats say, oh, God, if we could have that discipline, everything would be okay. We could pass a health care bill, or at least something we call a health care bill. But then there would be absolutely no opposition to wars in Congress. You wouldn't get it out of 5 or 10 or 50 Congress members because the Democratic leader is against it. There would be, in fact, no support for the majority American position on almost any issue because the Democratic leader is against it. So party discipline, to my mind, is not an ideal solution. It might look tempting in some instances. And my ideal is not necessarily multiplying a bad thing. 3 parties, 4 parties, 5 parties, not necessarily going to fix everything. But I think that the same reforms that would allow more independent candidates would allow candidates who are with a third party or a fourth party. If you got rid of the ballot access rules and the bipartisan gerrymandering and so forth and so on, you open it up for other candidates with or without a party. So I think I hit on most of it.
Well, I guess I want to just say that I read your website today, and I was very heartened by the efficaciousness of your program and the sort of focusing on the Congress. And I agree with everything that you said today, and it heartens me to hear.
Thanks.
I guess I'm just asking though that. And I have been involved with the whole 9/11 question, and the only thing I'm asking, and as far as I'm concerned, I think serious people that are involved with it have no theories. I think it's a fool's errand. I think that's exactly where they wanted you to go, and that we have so little real information about what happened, and that they control it So what kind of theories can we actually put up? So the fact that you want to reinvestigate or to have a true investigation, that's the only thing I think that any sane people can, because what we were told was not true. Right. And you also started today with a real question, which I think we all have, people that, and I also appreciated the sort of ending of the Santa Claus notion surrounding any president. I thought that, in your article today, I thought that was really dead on. But given the fact that we do have a president that is intelligent and I think good-hearted, and you're sitting there and you're saying that he is supporting or furthering the ending of habeas corpus. I mean, it's something that's been a part of the law of the land for over 1,000 years. And I guess some people, that we would sit back and go, how is this possible? How could we, as a country, get to this? And I guess the one other question is that, and I wish this was true, David, believe me with everything in me, I wish that the American people felt the horror and the suffering of the Iraqi people, the 1.2 million Iraqi people, that they would share that with the same 3,000 people that died in New York. But I think it could be naive on our part to think, and I don't want to have to wait that long to change things. And so I think that it might be naive to try to wait until everybody has that same sort of world consciousness, which of course I hope is the future. So I'm not asking you to change your mind about the 9/11 thing or anything like that, but I do just ask you to not, sort of just remain open, and even it might be for just the emotional power alone that might have some sort of efficacious aspect to it that I think we all moving in a direction I think that we all want to move in. And so that's all I ask.
Well, first of all, I've been to a lot of, I've been doing this sort of thing for 5 years, but I've been doing this book tour for a couple months, and I've been to a lot of places all over the country, and I haven't gotten the 9/11 questions ever, where I used to get them all the time. This is the first event, I think, in this first 25 cities or so out of 50 that I'm doing where the 9/11 thing has come up. But I have to say I much prefer it to some of the questions I've gotten in a bunch of other events, because I've been to events where I get this sort of, but we've been trying, isn't everything hopeless, shouldn't we all kill ourselves kind of question, where people are just sort of coughing defeatism over their neighbors, which is worse than the flu, and you have no moral right to do that. And so for people to be asking, shouldn't we work on this project, whatever it is, I think is far preferable to that. I would much rather be in this room. But the idea of an emotional value in promoting something that I think is a falsehood, I think is a very dangerous idea. I think, when I say in terms of our activism directed at our national government, it should be focused on the House of Representatives, I'm not saying don't engage in research and education and so on. And people who are good at research should do research, and people who are good at counter-recruitment should do that. You should do what you're skilled at and interested in and so forth. And you should investigate and educate endlessly. But for me to keep an open mind about something after having read all the books and watched all the DVDs, it's like asking me to keep an open mind about the tooth fairy or something. I'll keep that open mind, but what does that mean? The other question about, having a president who has something good in his heart, but he's throwing out habeas corpus. I think we should all try to be active, engaged citizens like you guys are for a week without thinking about the president. Very, very difficult thing to do, but for God's sake, please try it. It doesn't make a goddamn bit of difference what's in his heart, one way or another. I don't watch soap operas and I don't investigate the president's heart. If he does good things, that's good luck. And if he does bad things, that's bad luck. But he asked a lot of questions. You're next. You don't have to keep your hand up. If we want to change what our government does, we have to go at the easiest place we can make that change. Now, if we feel good about venting our anger at the president, we should do that. And if we think that there are facts that need to be exposed to people, we should do that as members of the media. But our activism has to go where it's most useful. And I had a leader of a national peace organization arguing with me today about the same article that I think you read, telling me, if you trust the president and you trust the status of forces agreement, we're leaving Iraq, and we succeeded in doing that without doing necessarily exactly what you want to do, and so forth. And I'm thinking, my God, here's a guy who campaigned, I'm going to pull out 2 brigades a month for the first 16 months. Here we are in month 11, and it hasn't started yet. And he wants me to trust him, to trust a president and to trust a treaty, that's being violated. When you have top generals saying, we're not going to comply with the treaty, we're going to stay in Iraq, and you have the treaty saying, we're going to leave, which one am I supposed to trust? Here we have a president whose Justice Department is appealing and reappealing any case that would expose any criminality by Bush or Cheney, making phone companies part of the executive branch of the government, threatening to cut off intelligence sharing with Great Britain, fighting to keep Cheney's FBI interviews secret where he outs Valerie Plame and so forth. And people are saying, but he's the good cop, and they're the other team. They're the ones who call him a grandmother killer and a socialist. But a president has an interest in his predecessor not going to prison for crimes that he's continuing. It's an obvious interest. It doesn't matter where you think his heart is, And it's not that you voted for the wrong guy. It's that elections by themselves don't do anything. Never have, never will. And if they did, they'd be banned. You begin your work as a citizen the day after the election. You vote for the better of the 2 lousy choices you've got. And you don't regret it. It was the right thing to do. But it was a split second in a lifetime of citizen engagement. We had a coup in 2000. We had a coup in 2004. We had an election in 2008, and we behaved like we had a coup. We went home and said, I'm going to sit on my hands and let them take care of things for a while. With these absurd expectations followed by absurd disappointment. And I think we could get over the disappointment if we recognized that entire process was inappropriate. Not just most of it, the entire thing. You gave this guy 1 day, and you got Rahm Emanuel now running the White House. The health insurance companies didn't give him 1 hour. It's your role. It's the respectful thing to do, to not treat someone as a dictator. But you can't influence a president. It's almost impossible, but you can influence your House members. I think just try to go for a week without thinking about him and see what else you do think about. Yes.
We've been concentrating a great deal on the domestic side of this, but I am wondering what you think of what would happen if we did withdraw in pursuant to the status of forces agreement, or if we withdrew from Afghanistan. So the Taliban would take over Afghanistan again for however long they can hold up. Things change there too. Iraq, after we smashed the artificial construct of the state of Iraq, do you agree that our presence there has only held up the inevitable civil war that will end up in a new order for that area of the world, be that 3 countries or another strongman? What would happen if we did go home? And would it matter to us?
What would happen anywhere to masses of human beings ought to matter to us. It certainly would matter to me. I'm sure it would matter to you.
I meant what consequences would it have for us? I didn't mean about the moral aspect of does it matter to us. I meant what would be the consequences, practical consequences?
What about the oil?
Okay, I've got a lot of questions piling up here. I'll try to do my best, but I don't know how to make a distinction between moral consequences and practical consequences. It's not a distinction I understand or am able to make.
Can I rephrase it into what would happen?
Yes, you may. If this is what you always get asked on talk shows, and in talking with the people making these decisions, I had an opportunity to ask a guy named Zbigniew Brzezinski about this the other day, who was a national security advisor to Jimmy Carter, and I said,
the one with the gun in Afghanistan, way back. Do you remember?
I think so. Yeah, that would be appropriate for him in any case. I asked him, does it matter to you at all that the majority of Americans, or roughly half of Americans, oppose what you're saying is absolutely necessary and uncontroversial, that we have to stay in Afghanistan for a while? And he says, no, Americans, they get fatigued and tired out and they don't know any better, And I've been on talk shows with, quasi-experts and people who've been to Afghanistan for 3 days and so on, and I'll say, the American people's opinion is this. Doesn't that matter? And they'll say, well, the American people don't know any better. They're stupid. They're not informed. They don't know what languages are spoken in Afghanistan. They don't know what the terrain looks like. And then I'll say, what about the Afghan people? Do the Afghan people have any sort of expertise on Afghanistan? Because they want us to get the hell out. And the Iraqi people want us to get the hell out. And maybe the experts in the military are the experts at bombing. But are they the only kind of relevant experts on Afghanistan and Iraq? Because the people there, on whom we're imposing democracy, whatever that means, want us to leave. Now, if we do leave, everything won't be wonderful, especially if we leave without assisting in any of the things that are needed. Right? We have this idea that the only way we relate to the other nations around the world is through bombs and guns and soldiers and bases. Nobody I know wants to go from that to nothing. We need diplomacy, we need aid, we need economic relationships, but we don't need military occupations and wars. And so I know that our televisions tell us that the Taliban will completely take over, and the Taliban will invite Al-Qaeda in, and Al-Qaeda will make us less safe, and so forth. And I'm not sure any of those premises are so certain. The greatest recruitment tool of the Taliban right now is the U.S. occupation. Some of the leaders of the Taliban are religious nutcases. Most people who are what we call the Taliban are people fighting so they can eat dinner that night. And we aren't offering as big a paycheck as the Taliban is. And we aren't creating alternatives for nonviolent employment. The Taliban never was completely in control, so the idea of it coming back completely into control is wrong. I doubt very much it would have complete control, whatever we mean by the Taliban in any sense. But it's also much less likely that it's going to bring Al-Qaeda in, or that would make us significantly less safe in any way.
Or the warlords, for that matter.
Or what?
Or the warlords. Where's Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and our good old friend Dostum, that paragon of culture?
and immunity for crimes, just like our warlords. We're working with these people. We're working with the drug lords and the warlords, and women are not better off. The nation is not better off. The one thing that is certain in these occupations is that if we stay there, things keep getting worse. What happens if we leave? In some scenarios, things get worse. In some scenarios, things get better. But in any event, as long as we stay, international law is damaged. I mean, there's some place, the fact that this is all illegal has to come into this conversation. But I think it's entirely appropriate to wonder what happens when we leave, and to work to make that a better situation. But we do it through aid and diplomacy. We don't do it through ignoring international law or even treaties that we've made with our puppet government. Yeah.
Having built the largest war base, having built the largest war base that's ever been built in
Baghdad.
Do you actually think it's possible that the U.S. would actually completely pull out, having invested all that money there and built that?
Well, it's clearly not the intention. The intention from years before we went in this way was to stay forever, and the intention clearly appears to be to stay forever.
The oil's gone.
Well, that could be a while, but if there's oil in neighboring countries, if there's reasons to want to have power all over the globe, ideally these people want to stay forever. And the best possible fantasy you can imagine them easily agreeing to would be to leave all the other bases, but not that one, and call that an embassy. But it's an embassy that's bigger than the Vatican. It's a military base in the middle of a city.
I guess another question is, calling your House of Representatives doesn't call the corporations that are boosting the House of Representatives and paying all the paychecks of everybody. So, and I assume that's part of what that war base is for, is providing money in a bunch of different ways and keeping relations up in that sort of sphere. So I'm just curious how calling your House of I really think that that's a great way, which I haven't done, but...
Well, I don't think you should spend too much time calling the House of Representatives, but I think you should call and email and fax. But more, I think you should go after them in the local media, which can include denouncing the ways in which they are bought and paid for by corporations. And I think you should go to their offices and sit there and not leave. And if you're worried about it, get training in how to refrain from slapping a cop. And, if you're scared about the legal repercussions, find out, are they going to call it a federal building? Is it going to be a tougher charge against you and so forth? But for the most part, it's nothing dangerous or traumatic or difficult about taking a few hours out of your day and disrupting their work and bringing the media. And bring with you polls on where constituents are, and bring with you information on who they're actually working for. Right? You go to opensecrets.org and look at who gave them money. That's who they're working for. And then you go to costofwar.org or .com, and you look at how much have we paid in tax money just from Martha's Vineyard, or just from this district, or just from Massachusetts. And then you multiply that by 3 or 4 or 5 times, because you got to take care of the veterans, and it's all borrowed money with interest and so on. And then you go to usaspending.gov, and you look at who all the big government contractors are in your state and your district. And you got to read quite a ways before you get to anything other than weapons and military contractors. In most cases, there's some health company contractors, but this is where the government money is going. And Massachusetts Amherst, the university there, has the best research and the best studies that document very, very well that you get a lot more jobs and better paying jobs with non-military spending than you do with military spending. So they can't just say, oh, well, we need jobs, because they're losing jobs by spending our money in that way. And so it's not that I want to protect the corporations, but you can't unelect them. You can't defund them. You can't as some of my friends have been doing for the past month, going around and getting arrested one day at this health insurance company, the next day at that health insurance company. You need a massive, coordinated, multi-pronged campaign for months and months to economically hurt one corporation. And you have to target that one corporation. It's very, very difficult. And once you've done it, some other corporation is going to do the same stuff. Whereas if you can change the laws and get the laws enforced, then you can bring all of the corporations under the rule of law. We might see this week, a ruling from the Supreme Court that dwarfs all the corruption anybody's ever heard of, that says no limits on corporate money in elections. Which means, you could take 1% of the profits of a major U.S. corporation and swamp all the money corrupting Washington last year, right? And there's a lot more than one corporation, and they have a lot of profits. And this is going to be a moment of, if this happens, I think this may be a moment of intense outrage and activism. And there are coalitions being put together to try to seize this moment to fight this idea that money is speech and corporations are persons, right? Because it's a defense of the free speech right of corporations to bribe people as speech, when they're not persons and they don't, spending money isn't speaking. So corporations are the root of all evil, and corporations can do very good things, but when we've given corporations these powers and these immunities, but when you do a campaign to try to change something, you have to do what's going to be effective as well as what denounces evil entities.
It's that good statistic of the top 100 grossing entities. 51 of them are corporations and 49 of them are countries.
Yeah, that's right. And a lot of those corporations are largely U.S. corporations.
Or multinational.
Yeah.
Cars
They have no national.
Yes.
I wanted to say something about corporations, but I wanted to hark back first to where you talked about how the media denigrate popular opinion, this sort of distorted mirror that they hold up to us and say, these are your countrymen, and that struck me as being like it's another phase of the fostering of mistrust in democracy. Of course, the corporate interests and the right-wingers and their interests mistrust democracy because they don't want their elite preferences taken away from them. But they turn that around and make those of us who are actually in the majority mistrust our fellow citizens.
Right. I mean, most of us want to get the corporate influence out and the media and the party influence, but most of us don't have a deep understanding of wanting majority opinion to rule. Most of us seem to sort of want someone on our side representing our minority opinion on things to run roughshod over the rest of the country. That's sort of our ideal.
One my dictator.
Right, our dictator. You see progressive websites where people are saying, can't Obama just sign and statement this for us? When the next president could just undo that. It's not something you can control. That's asking for a benevolent dictator. And in a lot of cases, fantasizing that this particular guy would be one, which I think is obviously very questionable. But that's a dangerous idea. When this question of escalating Afghanistan came up, the White House said, we're going to ignore Congress. It's nice of them to let us know we can ignore them, but we were going to ignore them anyway. And we're going to ignore opinion polls. And everybody, thank you, Mr. President, for ignoring us, too. They don't say things that they don't think people are going to like, right? I mean, when they asked Dick Cheney on television, does it matter to you that most Americans don't approve of what you're doing in Iraq? He said, so? One-word answer, so? And then in the follow-up, he says, I ignore the ups and downs of public opinion polls, right? I'm a principled. Right, exactly. But, before the...
manipulated.
Well, opinion polls can be dishonest. They are all imperfect, but they are a measure of public opinion. And that's supposed to be the proper sovereign of this nation. And yet we don't even really understand ourselves that it should be in most cases, I think. And we hear things like that. I'm going to ignore opinion polls, and we applaud. We think of the public as one more corrupting force. We think, if we could term limit people, then they wouldn't be subject to fear of what the public might do to them in the next election. We want them to be afraid of what the public might do to them in the next election. We don't think we want that because elections have been so corrupted by money and media and parties and so forth. But we have to clean that up, not get rid of it. What are you left with if you get rid of it? You know, I remember when we worked to raise the minimum wage down in New Orleans, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the hotels and the restaurants told the media, look, we're not even going to fight them at the polls. We're going to fight them in court afterwards. So they take us to court, and the local judge rules in our favor with the help of a wonderful economist from the University of Massachusetts. And then the spokes jerks for the Chamber of Commerce and so on tell the media, well, of course she's going to rule for them. She gets elected to office. She wants to please the people in New Orleans. As if that's corruption, right? And so then they take it to the Louisiana State Supreme Court, and they throw it out. And every single judge has a different cockamamie reason for why they throw it out, but they agree to throw it out. And then, well, these are principled scholars who are above the corruption of public opinion. Public opinion is democracy, right? So we have to watch our own thinking sometimes.
So to go on to the thing about corporations, there was a wonderful interview with a guy named John Hinckley in Sun magazine, which is down in your neck of the woods, and not too far away. He is a former corporate lawyer, and he's been going around, and there are several movements like this, dealing with the problem with corporations ever since the Supreme Court in 1886 said a corporation is a person under the law. And then there was this rush to...
Or didn't really say that, as the case may be.
Well, but state by state, removing all restrictions on corporations. This sort of rush to the bottom, and Delaware won, which is why so many corporations are incorporated there. But they took away all responsibilities that a person has. So the point of his endeavor is to state by state get 28 words added to the state constitution, affirming the responsibilities the corporation has to society, the environment, and so forth. The problem that he identifies is that the directors and executives of corporations are legally bound to satisfy the needs and wishes of their shareholders, which is usually short-term profitability. And so this amendment to state constitutions would free them from that restriction. It wouldn't automatically result in their ethical behavior, but at least it would remove that enforcement of unethical behavior.
Yeah. Well, I think it's an excellent idea, but I would also like to see corporations deprived of human rights as if they are persons, as if the Bill of Rights is for corporations.
The dilemma there is the function of a corporation is to insulate the individual shareholders and principals from direct personal consequences if the corporation should fail financially. So you've got to solve that conundrum. That was a way that was justified as a way of solving that conundrum, but there has to be some way of resolving that so the basic function of the corporation still survives.
Okay, but if we had a more explicit and enforced right to vote, then we might see that enforced with national standards where we vote on actual pieces of paper and they're counted publicly at the polling place before all witnesses and posted and then added up regionally, and we know that we actually voted for the person we voted for. Right now, we aren't allowed to see how our votes are counted because they're a trade secret of a corporation. A corporation has a right that outweighs our right.